Hey everyone, Joe here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with limiters in mixing and mastering. I'm going to go over what they are exactly, what they can do, and how to use them. So to start things off, what exactly is a limiter? A limiter in a nutshell is basically a compressor with a very high ratio setting. So if you're not sure what a compressor is, I'll give you a brief overview because it's important that you understand compression to enable you to understand limiting. So a compressor is a dynamic range processor, a tool that when applied to audio lets you reduce the level of the signal when the signal gets over a certain threshold. So it allows us to reduce the dynamic range, reduce the level of very loud parts of a piece of audio, and also make things louder, essentially squashing the signal. How much that signal is reduced by depends on what the ratio is set at. I'm just going to show you a quick diagram to help you understand. So if this is our song, our music, and this is the threshold, so anything that goes over that red line is going to get squashed by the compressor. The ratio is how much that gets squashed by. So if the ratio is set at 2:1, for example, you can see here on this compressor, I've set the ratio at 2:1. Every 2 decibels that go over that threshold, only 1 decibel is going to come out the other side. So it's going to reduce it by 1 decibel. So a limiter is basically a compressor that has a very high ratio setting, so it's really squashing that audio that goes over the threshold. There's no specific ratio setting that means a compressor suddenly becomes a limiter. I'd consider it sort of maybe 20:1 or up, but it's more about how it's used. And then a limiter with an infinite ratio, so infinity to 1, it means that no audio is allowed over that threshold. And this is what we call a brick wall or peak limiter. So for example, with this limiter I have here, we just have an out ceiling. So if it's set at, say, -1 decibel, it's no audio is going to be allowed over the top of that threshold. And that's what we call a peak limiter. And you'll see this in action in part 3. Now, this is commonly used when mastering to get the most loudness possible. You can see an example here where that ceiling's set right at the top, and we've pushed the level of the audio up and nothing is allowed over the top of it. So all limiters are compressors, but not all compressors are limiters. And there are some common misconceptions there, that for a limiter to be a limiter, it has to be a brick wall limiter with that infinite ratio. But yeah, there's no specific ratio where a compressor becomes a limiter. It depends more on how it's used. And that's why you often get plugins or hardware units more commonly that you'd call a compressor limiter because it can be used for both functions. And in terms of when you'd use a limiter, like I said, they're always found in mastering to get the highest possible volume out of something. They're also used in mixing, sometimes at lower ratios, sometimes at higher ratios, to keep the level sort of tamed, get the most out of a signal in the same way you'd use a compressor. They're often used in live environments as well to make sure that the signal doesn't go over a certain level and, blow everyone's eardrums. Now let's take a look at a couple of limiter plugins. I'm going to show you the settings you typically find on one and explain exactly what they do. So we've got a couple of limiters here. Let's take a look at this one. This is the Waves L1 Ultra Maximizer. This is the one I tend to use the most for mastering. So it's quite a simple peak limiter that's used for mastering. There's no ratio because, like I said, nothing is going to be going past that out ceiling. So let's look at the ceiling first, or out ceiling as it's labeled on this particular plugin. You can bring that down, and wherever you bring that ceiling to, the signal's not going to go over that. So if it's at -10, we're not going to get a signal that goes over -10 dB. If the signal is already going over that before you set the ceiling, it's going to be pushing against that ceiling, and you're going to start to get some heavy compression. And then the threshold setting, you might see this labeled as gain. You bring that down, and it's basically bringing the threshold down where it's going to start boosting the signal. So the lower it goes, the louder it's going to be, because it's catching more of the signal to to make up the gain on. Here it's getting louder. And over here, we've got a gain reduction meter that's showing us how many decibels the limiter is reducing the signal by. So it's hitting that ceiling, and every time it hits it with that snare, it's reducing it by around 6 to 10 dB. So in a similar way to a compressor, it's only really reducing that very loud snare there. And then oftentimes with the limiter, you'll also find an attack or a release setting, often just the release. It works in the same way as a release on a compressor. This is how quickly the limiter is going to stop limiting that signal. So if we bring it right down to a millisecond, as soon as that audio goes back below the threshold, it's going to stop squashing it for a very kind of quick action limiter. And then you can bring that up to 1,000 milliseconds. And that means it's going to be affecting the signal between peaks as well, which again, you'll hear in part 3 when you see it in action. And then over here, you'll find some settings that are used for when you're mastering. So when mastering, often if you're using a 24-bit session, you'll be bouncing down to a 16-bit file for CD, because that's the standard for CD. But when you downsample from 24-bit to 16-bit, it can create quantization errors, which can come across as noise, basically, distortion. So you'll often find your limiter has a dither option, which applies a low level of noise to the signal. I'll go over this more in the mastering video. I'll leave a link on the screen now, but basically that's what it's for. It's for downsampling to lower bit rates. Now I'm going to move over to another session and demonstrate how you can use a limiter in your mixes or masters. Okay, so here we are in a mastering session. We've got a mix here that we want to get the most level possible out of without crushing those lovely dynamics. We don't want too small of a dynamic range. So I'm just going to grab a loud part of the song, play it on a loop, and get our limiter out. And I want to set the ceiling at minus 0.1. Get the most out of this as possible, get the most level out of it as possible without hitting that 0 dB mark. I mean, you could set it to 0 and it shouldn't cause any digital clipping, because it's when it goes over 0 that you get the digital clipping, that horrible distortion. But when you create an MP3, when you compress the WAV file, it can cause little peaks and things. So just to be safe, I'm going to bring it down by a point of a dB, and then we're bouncing to a 16-bit file. And now let's hit play. So if you watch that master, that meter there, when we bring the level up, see it's not clipping. If we didn't have that out ceiling on there, and we just raise the volume, it's going to be clipping. But this ceiling stops it from reaching that point. And then with the release setting, as I said, a long release, it's really crushing that dynamic range. You can hear it's very kind of smooth and level, and you can see the gain reduction is hovering around the same area. And if we reduce that, you can see it's moving up and down a lot more. It's fast acting. You get more of the transients retained as well. So we want to get a nice balance where it still sounds natural and it still sounds punchy, but we can get as much level out of it as possible. Okay, we don't want to completely crush it. Yeah, we're getting a lot of signal out of there. I probably wouldn't go quite as hard on that for the actual master. But just to demonstrate how to use it. And this is just one use of a limiter. Again, occasionally I'd use it in a mix, for example, on drums. If I've got some really dynamic drums that I want to tame, possibly on a mix bus as well. to keep it below a certain level to be sent off the master. But yeah, I hope that's given you a good idea on what exactly a limiter is and how you can use one. And let me know in the comments section below, what's your favorite limiter plugin to use? And if you have any more questions at all, just leave a comment and I'll help out. And if you want to see more mixing tips and tutorials just like this, then hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.